I want you to imagine, just for a second, that you are 16 years old,
Right.
but you're not just any teenager. It is the year 1812. You are the Crown Prince of Prussia, and your kingdom is, well, it's staring down the barrel of an existential threat.
Oh, absolutely. A massive threat.
Yeah, Napoleon Bonaparte is just tearing across Europe. He is completely reshaping the map with artillery fire, tearing up centuries-old empires. And you, as the crown prince, are entirely expected to one day lead armies into that exact same meat grinder.
It's a lot of pressure for a 16-year-old.
I mean, to say the least, right.
Yeah.
Now imagine your military tutor, the guy who's basically responsible for keeping you from making a fool of yourself on the battlefield, or, worse, getting your entire army annihilated. He's leaving.
He's heading off to fight the French himself.
Exactly. But before he walks out the door, he hands you a personalized, handwritten cheat sheet, like a survival guide on how to conquer, how to defend, and how to command when the world around you is quite literally on fire.
It is an incredible historical artifact. I mean, we are talking about a document that just strips away all the pomp and circumstance of 19th century royalty.
Yeah, none of the parade ground stuff.
Right, no, it delivers pure, unfiltered survival tactics. And what we are looking at today is exactly that document.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission is to explore Karl von Clausewitz's 1812 essay, which is famously known as The Principles of War.
Yes.
But before we get into the mud and the musket smoke, we really need to talk about the physical reality of 1812 combat. Because if you don't understand the environment this teenager was being prepared for, I mean, none of Clausewitz's advice is going to make any sense at all.
That is such a crucial starting point. Modern audiences naturally project, modern technology onto the past.
Oh, totally. We picture walkie-talkies and drones.
Exactly. But in 1812, you have no radios, you have no aerial reconnaissance, you have black powder weapons, which means that after the first 5 minutes of a battle, the entire field is covered in a thick, choking, sulfurous white smoke. You literally cannot see your own army, let alone the enemy's.
It's just absolute chaos. I mean, you are managing tens of thousands of terrified men, horses, and cannons through a fog so thick you don't even know if your left flank is winning or running away.
Exactly. It's a sensory nightmare.
And into that chaos, Clausewitz hands this prince a manual. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the history of how this specific document has been interpreted over the last 2 centuries is, well, it's almost as wild as the military tactics inside it.
The historiography is fascinating. I mean, the version of the text we are analyzing today is a 1942 translation by a man named Hans W. Gatzke.
Right.
But the key to our understanding comes from a modern introduction provided by military historian Christopher Basford. Basford completely reshapes how we should be reading this text, primarily by pointing out that for decades, the entire Western world was getting this document completely fundamentally wrong.
Let's dig into that misconception. Because, when people hear the name Karl von Clausewitz, they immediately think of his massive philosophical magnum opus on war, which he published way later in 1832.
And that right there is the trap.
Yeah.
People constantly treat this 1812 essay as if it is the Cliff's Notes version of On War.
Oh, like a rough draft.
Right. They assume it's just a condensed summary of his mature grand theory of warfare. Basford is emphatic that this is a dangerous misreading.
How so?
Well, the 1812 essay is a primitive precursor. It was written when Clausewitz was much younger, long before he developed his deepest philosophical concepts about the political nature of war.
So it's not about politics at all?
No, its subject matter is largely tactical. It is based entirely on the raw mechanics of the wars of Frederick the Great and the early Napoleonic conflicts.
It's a snapshot of a younger, more tactical thinker. But let's fast forward from 1812 to 1942. This is when Hans Gatzke, who was a German immigrant serving in the U.S. Army, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So he translates this text into English. And the context of 1942 is impossible to ignore. I mean, the globe is engulfed in the Second World War. The translation hits the American market, and the publisher slaps this incredibly provocative dust jacket on the book.
Oh, the dust jacket is wild.
Yeah. Basford describes it as featuring an armor-clad, hand-wielding geometric instruments, like literally drawing up military blueprints.
It looks like a prop from a dystopian science fiction movie.
Right.
The imagery was designed to evoke a cold, calculated, mechanical menace, and the rhetoric surrounding the book's release was equally sensational. Basford highlights a review from the 1942 Cavalry Journal that literally called this 1812 essay the blueprint from which Nazi Germany has developed the present total war.
Okay, I have to stop and push back on the logic of those 1942 reviewers. I want to make sure we are impartially laying out what Batsford is arguing here without, getting bogged down in 1940s politics. We're just looking at the historiography. But from a purely analytical standpoint, how on earth did anyone make that leap?
It's a huge stretch.
I mean, people were reading a tactical guide written for a teenager in the era of muskets, bayonets, and cavalry charges, and they were projecting 20th century total war, mechanized panzer divisions, and dive bombers onto it. Like, how much of this 1812 text actually deals with grand societal strategy versus just moving guys with muskets around a muddy field?
You are hitting on the exact absurdity that Bassford points out. It is a massive, illogical leap. The essay is deeply rooted in the linear and columnar tactics of its day.
So it's basically just projection.
Pure projection. They were looking at a historical text and seeing only their own contemporary anxieties. Society often does this. We weaponize history to explain our current fears.
Right, we look for a neat origin story.
Exactly. They feared the German war machine, so they looked for a foundational blueprint to explain it, and they twisted a 19th century tutor's manual to fit that narrative.
It's like finding a recipe for a medieval catapult and claiming it's the blueprint for a nuclear submarine.
That is a very apt comparison. It really is. Furthermore, Bassford notes another major historical fallacy. People often assume that Clausewitz was just writing down Napoleon's secret formulas.
Because they call Clausewitz the high priest of Napoleon, right?
Yes, they do, yes. But the tactical views in this text aren't even Napoleon's. They are actually the conceptions of Clausewitz's own mentor, General Gerhard von Scharnhorst.
Oh, wait, really?
Yeah, and Scharnhorst was a Prussian reformer who spent his career figuring out how to fight Napoleon.
Wow. So the audience in 1942 fundamentally misunderstood the text on almost every level. They saw an unstoppable, calculated blueprint for modern total war rather than what it actually was. A seasoned officer trying to give a teenager some practical, albeit incredibly ruthless, advice on how to survive a 19th century battlefield.
That's exactly it.
So if we strip away all that 20th century baggage, we can actually look at what Clausewitz told the prince. He starts the essay at the highest possible altitude with a section he calls Principles for War in General. And right out of the gate, he introduces a tension that I think is just fascinating. He pits physical math against the human mind.
Clausewitz acknowledges that the theory of warfare inherently tries to solve a math problem.
Like counting troops.
Right. The goal is to discover how to gain a physical preponderance of forces at the decisive point. If you have 10,000 men and the enemy has 5,000 and you meet at a crossroads, well, the math says you win.
Basic arithmetic.
Theory wants to find those physical advantages. But Clausewitz immediately warns the prince that this mathematical certainty is a luxury you rarely get. You aren't always going to have the bigger army. You aren't always going to have the higher ground.
And when the physical math fails, when you are, outnumbered and outgunned, what does he say you do? Because you don't just surrender.
Far from it. When physical factors are against you, Clausewitz argues that theory must calculate what he calls moral factors.
Let's clarify that term, actually, because in modern English, moral usually implies ethics, like being a good person. That's not what he means here, is it?
Not in the slightest. He is talking about psychological factors. Morale, fear, momentum, shock.
The human element.
Precisely. He tells the prince that when you are outnumbered, you have to calculate the likely mistakes of the enemy commander. You have to calculate the psychological impression that a wildly daring, unexpected action will have on the enemy troops. And, perhaps most difficult of all, you have to learn how to leverage your own desperation.
Leveraging your own desperation. I mean, that is such a raw, brutal way to approach leadership.
It is.
He essentially tells the prince that when the likelihood of success is completely against you, you must act against the probability of victory if there is nothing better to do.
To despair.
To just give up because the spreadsheet says you have a 10% chance of surviving is to abandon reason itself.
It is a profound philosophy of resilience. Clausewitz insists that the commander must familiarize themselves with the thought of an honorable defeat.
Honorable defeat.
Yes. He writes that you must nourish this thought within yourself and get completely used to it. The logic is dark, but sound. If you haven't made peace with the idea of losing everything, you will freeze when the crisis comes.
You'll be paralyzed.
Exactly. You will be paralyzed by the fear of losing your army, and that paralysis will guarantee your destruction.
He backs this up with a very specific historical example, pointing to Frederick II at the Battle of Leuthen in 1757. I want to spend some time here because this really illustrates the concept of acting against probability.
The Battle of Leuthen is a masterclass in this philosophy. Frederick the Great was facing an Austrian army that vastly outnumbered his Prussian forces.
The math was entirely against him.
Entirely. It was winter, his men were tired, and a conventional head-on attack would have meant mathematical suicide.
But Frederick attacks anyway. And Clausewitz points out that Frederick didn't attack because he thought his tactics, specifically his famous oblique formation, provided some, guaranteed mathematical certainty for a win. He attacked because he had absolutely no better option.
Right. Let's look at that tactic, the oblique formation, because it perfectly marries the physical and the psychological. Instead of marching his army in a long, straight line to smash evenly against the longer Austrian line, Frederick concentrated his forces on one side, creating a heavy, weighted wing.
Like a battering ram on one side.
Exactly. He then marched this weighted wing at an angle, striking the edge of the Austrian line and rolling it up from the side.
It's like pushing over the first domino in a line, rather than trying to push all the dominoes over at once from the front.
That's a great way to visualize it. But Clausewitz's point is that Frederick didn't execute this maneuver because it was a risk-free equation. The march to get into that position was incredibly dangerous.
Oh, I'm sure.
If the Austrians had realized what he was doing earlier, they could have destroyed him while he was moving. Frederick acted because he was entirely prepared for an honorable defeat. He acted despite the probability, not because of it.
It reminds me of a desperate moment in a high-stakes poker game. You look down at your cards, and you have, like, a 2 and a 7 offsuit. The absolute worst hand. The physical cards, the math are entirely against you. If you just play the odds, you fold.
Right.
But if folding means your stack dwindles to nothing and you lose the tournament anyway, you don't play the cards anymore. You play the player. You push all your chips into the center. You use audacity and the psychological impact of a massive, terrifying bluff to try and win the pot. Theory doesn't say, fold and slowly die. Theory says, be audacious.
What's fascinating here is that analogy captures the spirit perfectly, and it leads to a complete redefinition of the concept of caution. In everyday life, we think of caution as being careful, taking baby steps, holding back to protect yourself.
Sawing it safe.
Right. Clausewitz explicitly tells the prince that for great aims, we must dare great things. True caution, in his view, is not timidity. Timidity will get you killed slowly.
So what is Clausewitzian caution then?
True caution is being incredibly, obsessively thorough in your preparations. It means making sure your supply lines are perfect, your men are drilled, your powder is dry, and your reconnaissance is flawless.
Do the homework.
Do the homework. You do all of this obsessive preparation so that when you do execute your wildly audacious, highly improbable plan, it doesn't fail because of your own laziness or carelessness.
He actually praises Napoleon for this exact trait. He points out that Napoleon never pursued great aims in a timid, half-hearted way, but he was incredibly cautious and methodical in his preparations before the first shot was fired. You don't scale back the goal to make it safer. You scale up your effort and preparation to meet the massive goal.
That's the essence of it.
So that is the mindset. The young prince has to accept that he might lose his kingdom. He has to be prepared to be audacious, and he cannot let bad mathematical odds make him freeze. How does this abstract philosophy translate to the actual terrain? How do you move thousands of men based on this mindset?
Right, getting down to the actual fighting.
Exactly. This brings us to the tactics section of the essay. Clausewitz divides this into defense and offense. I want to start with defense because when I read this section, it completely shattered my preconceived notions of what it means to defend something. I always assumed defense was about building a strong wall, spreading your guys out along it, and holding the line.
That is the natural layperson assumption. You want to cover every possible entry point.
Yeah, you plug all the holes.
But Clausewitz argues that when you are on the defensive, the extent of your front line, how wide your army is spread out, actually matters very little. The critical factor is depth.
Depth, meaning keeping troops behind the front line, not fighting, just standing there.
Standing ready. He lays down a fundamental principle that seems counterintuitive. Never remain completely passive. If you just sit behind an entrenchment and let the enemy hit you, the enemy controls the entire tempo of the battle.
They dictate the fight.
Exactly. They can probe your line, find the weak spot, mass their forces there, and break through. Therefore, Clausewitz argues that entrenchments and passive defenses are merely tools. They are bait.
Bait.
Yes. You use them to lure the enemy into an attack at a specific chosen point.
Wait, let me make sure I understand the geometry here. If I'm the defending commander, I build a trench or a redoubt, but I'm not building it to stop the enemy. I'm building it as a trap. I'm absorbing their punch on my shielded arm just so I can hit them with my other hand.
Gets the essence of what Clausewitz calls active defense. The terrain or the fortification serves to fix the enemy in place. You make them commit their forces, they charge the trench, they get bogged down trying to climb the walls or cross the moat.
And while they're stuck,
They are fully engaged, their attention is locked forward, and they are expending energy. Once they are trapped in that engagement, you take the troops you kept in reserve, your depth, and you launch a devastating counterattack, usually from the flanks.
it's basically a judo throw on a massive scale. You don't meet their forward momentum with a brick wall, you let them commit their forward momentum into a trap, and then you introduce a new force from a blind angle to sweep their legs out.
Exactly the right physics. You use their own offensive energy against them. And Clausewitz gives the prince very specific math for this. He writes that if you have 5 divisions, you should hold at least 2, maybe even 3, in reserve.
I found that mathematically shocking. You're hiding more than half your army. I mean, if I'm a soldier on the front line and I see 3 divisions just hanging out in the rear while I'm getting shot at, I'm going to be terrified. Aren't you just guaranteeing your front line gets overwhelmed?
It is an incredible psychological burden on the front line, but it is a strategic necessity for the commander. Clausewitz explains that the troops in the rear are the only ones the commander still controls.
Oh, because once they're fighting?
The moment troops step onto the front line and engage the enemy, they are locked in combat. The noise, the smoke, the adrenaline, they are no longer a maneuverable chess piece, they are a fixed object. The reserve gives you the flexibility to react.
That makes a lot of sense.
If the enemy tries to march around your trench, an outflanking maneuver, your reserve is there to stop them. If the enemy exhausts themselves against your trench, your reserve is there to become the hammer that crushes them against the anvil of your front line.
He backs this up with a ton of historical receipts. He mentions Duke Ferdinand at Minden, where Ferdinand suddenly appeared from concealment and took the offensive, and at Tannhausen, where he defended passively behind earthworks just to fix the enemy. He mentions General Moreau at Hohenlinden, who had 5 divisions in the front holding the line, but deliberately kept 4 hidden in the rear and on the flanks to crush the Austrians once they committed.
Yes, Hohenlinden's a classic example.
But the most vivid illustration he gives, the one that really made this click for me, is the contrast between Napoleon and the Austrian Archduke Charles at the battles of Ratisbon and Wagram.
The Battle of Wagram in 1809 is the perfect canvas to paint this concept of active defense in depth. We are talking about an unimaginably massive engagement, over 300,000 men on the field. The scale is staggering.
Paint the picture for us. What is the tactical dilemma at Wagram, and how do Napoleon and the Archduke handle it differently?
Well, both commanders actually attempt a very similar broad strategy.
Yeah.
Attack heavily with the right wing and hold out defensively with the left wing.
Okay, sounds standard.
But the execution is entirely different. Archduke Charles, commanding the Austrians, is wavering. He executes half measures. He spreads his forces too evenly. His victorious right wing achieves some success, but it lacks the overwhelming mass to be decisive.
And Napoleon.
Napoleon, on the other hand, pursues his aim with terrifying energy and absolute focus. Napoleon's left wing is resting against the Danube River. It is incredibly weak. The Austrians attack it fiercely, and Napoleon basically ignores it.
I still struggle to wrap my head around the cold-bloodedness of that decision. He is watching his own left wing collapse. He is watching his men get pushed back toward the river, which is a lethal place to be trapped.
Yeah.
And he does nothing to help them.
He deliberately lets them get beaten back. Why? Because he has organized immense formation in depth on his right and in his center. He has hoarded massive reserves.
Oh, so he's trading space for time.
Exactly. He knows that if he sends his reserves to plug the holes on the left, he loses his striking power. He becomes entirely reactive. Instead, he allows the left wing to bend, absorbing the Austrian punch. Then, he uses those massive hoarded reserves to launch a colossal concentrated attack, retaking a highly strategic village called Aderkla in the center and shattering the Austrian line.
He sacrifices his left wing because he knows he can win the overall battle in the center and on the right. That requires nerves of absolute steel. You have to stand there listening to the desperate reports from your left flank commanders begging for reinforcements, and you have to say no.
It requires religious adherence to one of Clausewitz's core maxims. Pursue one great decisive aim with force and determination. You cannot get distracted trying to save every single unit. You cannot try to be strong everywhere. If you try to defend every inch of ground, you defend nothing. You focus all your energy, all your depth on delivering the one annihilating blow that ends the battle.
So if defense is really just a masked attack, a judo trap designed to set up a devastating counterpunch, how does Clausewitz instruct the prince to handle a pure offensive? If you were the one instigating, how do you just walk up and hit an enemy who is likely trying to set their own trap?
The transition from active defense to pure offense in this text hinges on one defining concept: overwhelming concentration at a single point.
Just piling everyone into one spot.
Clausewitz tells the prince that you must select one specific section of the enemy's line, a single division or corps, and attack it with extreme, overwhelming superiority. You leave the rest of their army in uncertainty. You might send a few skirmishers to keep them mildly occupied and guessing, but you pour all your real strength into cracking that one specific point.
And he emphasizes that you should avoid long, unbroken lines. When we picture historical warfare, especially from the movies, we picture the Revolutionary War. Two giant, straight lines of men standing in a field trading volleys until one side falls down. Clausewitz explicitly tells the prince not to do this. He says divisions should attack separately. Why break the lineup?
This represents a crucial evolution in the mechanics of war. Clausewitz is recognizing the physical limitations of command. You cannot micromanage a massive modern army of 100,000 men from a central point.
There's no megaphones loud enough.
Right. You cannot have generals on horseback trying to keep perfect, rigid alignment across 3 miles of broken terrain, especially when the field is covered in smoke and chaos. The friction is too high.
This leads to a section that I found incredibly modern. Clausewitz outlines exactly how a supreme commander should handle delegation. He says you give a division commander the main direction of their march, you point out the enemy they need to hit, you make victory the goal, and then you let them go.
You completely release control.
Yeah. You don't hold that division commander responsible for the ultimate grand success of the entire battle. You only hold them responsible for fighting with maximum energy and self-sacrifice in their specific sector.
It is the conceptual birth of independent command, what the Germans would later call Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics.
I love that concept.
It's vital. A well-organized independent corps can withstand an attack for hours on its own. Clausewitz argues that even if a subordinate commander engages prematurely and gets defeated, their fight wasn't in vain. Because by fighting intensely, they force the enemy to expend strength, they force the enemy to reveal their true position, and they created an opening for the rest of your army to exploit.
Here's where it gets really interesting. To really ground this for the listener, Clausewitz actually breaks down the exact mechanical sequencing of an 1812 attack. It is highly structured. It's almost like a recipe or the staging of a rocket launch. You don't just yell, "Charge," and everyone runs forward. There is an order of operations.
The battle array. It is essential to walk through this sequence because it shows how different arms, artillery, infantry, cavalry, were combined for maximum destructive effect.
Let's do it.
Stage 1 of the sequence is always the artillery.
And he is very specific about the geometry of artillery. He tells the prince, you must mass 20 to 30 cannons at one single point. He breaks down the spatial math. A battery of cannons takes up less than a third of the physical front of an infantry battalion. It requires a fraction of the men to operate, but its destructive fire is 2-3 times as effective. You do not spread your cannons out evenly along your line. You bunch them all together to blast a physical hole in the enemy's formation.
Imagine the physics of a solid iron cannonball bouncing through a dense formation of human beings.
It's horrific.
It is. That is what the massed artillery is designed to do. Once the artillery has spent time softening the target and creating chaos, you move to stage 2. You send in the light infantry.
These are the skirmishers, right? The marksmen who don't fight in straight lines.
Correct. You don't throw your main heavy infantry force in yet. You send the light troops forward in loose, open order. They hide behind rocks and trees. They test the waters to see what's actually ahead of you in the smoke. But their primary purpose is psychological and physical exhaustion.
You let the enemy burn through their limited ammunition, their energy, and their adrenaline fighting ghosts in the woods. You annoy them to death.
Yes, exactly.
And then when the enemy line is disorganized and exhausted by the skirmishers, you initiate stage 3, the full infantry.
The main body, drawn up 100 to 200 paces away, organized not in thin lines, but in deep, dense columns. Their job is not to stand and trade musket fire. Their job is momentum. They drive forward for the decisive physical shock of a bayonet charge to break the enemy line once and for all.
And what about the guys on horses? Stage 4, the cavalry. Clausewitz is absolutely adamant about where the cavalry belongs during this entire process. They must be kept strictly in the rear, completely out of musket fire range. You do not use cavalry to open the combat. You do not use them to charge unbroken infantry lines. You only unleash the cavalry when the enemy finally breaks and starts to run.
The discipline required for a cavalry commander to sit in the rear listening to the battle rage for hours and do absolutely nothing is immense, but it is vital. Because cavalry moves faster than infantry, they are the ultimate tool for ruthless pursuit. Clausewitz writes, next to victory, the active pursuit is most important in war.
If you let them go, they come back.
Exactly. If you defeat the enemy but let them walk away, they will fight you again tomorrow. You use the cavalry to chase them down, capture their artillery, and turn a retreat into a total rout.
Or, he notes, the cavalry is used to execute a sweeping strategic turning move, riding entirely around the enemy's flank while they are pinned down by your infantry. So you have this beautiful, terrifying machine. The cannons blast a hole, the skirmishers exhaust the defenders, the infantry punches through the hole, and the cavalry chases down the survivors.
It's a brutal choreography.
But this machine doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates on physical Earth. Which brings us to a really fascinating section of the essay, Clausewitz's principles for the use of geography and terrain.
Terrain is the canvas on which all these tactical theories are painted. Clausewitz notes that geography offers a commander two distinct things: obstacles to slow the enemy's approach and cover to hide your own troops. And he strongly, explicitly prefers the latter.
This was a massive aha moment for me. If you're listening to this right now and you imagine yourself suddenly put in charge of an army, what is your first instinct? If you see a massive, steep mountain in front of you, the natural human urge is to say, perfect, let's march to the top of that mountain, build a fortress, and dare the enemy to come get us. We all want the high ground. But Clausewitz is about to ruin your day. He says that instinct is a trap.
He issues a very stark warning to the young prince. Do not rely too heavily on strong terrain. Do not be enticed into a passive defense just because a mountain looks incredibly imposing. He asks a very logical question. If a mountain or a river is truly that formidable, what will a smart enemy commander do?
They aren't going to attack it. They'll just walk around it.
Exactly. They will turn your flank. They will render your amazing, impregnable fortress entirely useless. If you put your entire army on an impassable mountain, you have essentially taken yourself out of the game. The enemy will simply march past your mountain, capture your supply lines, burn your cities, and leave you sitting on a rock with no food.
So if taking the highest peak is a trap, how does Clausewitz tell the prince to actually use a mountain?
The method he advocates is brilliant and entirely psychological. He says, do not put your troops on the very crest of the mountain, where the enemy can see them from miles away and shell them with artillery. Put your troops behind the crest, on the reverse slope.
I can see the geometry of that. It is so nasty.
It is incredibly lethal. You might leave a thin screen of sharpshooters at the very top edge to harass the enemy as they begin their climb, but you keep your main force hidden, sitting quietly just over the back of the hill. The attacking enemy has to laboriously climb the steep grade. They are exhausted, their formations are breaking up because of the rocky terrain, and they can't see what's waiting for them. The literal second they reach the top, expecting to finally catch their breath and survey the field.
Boom. They are met with point-blank musket fire and a downhill bayonet charge from a fresh, perfectly formed infantry line that was waiting just 30 yards out of sight. You let the terrain do the exhausting work for you, and you use the terrain as a visual shield to hide your trap.
He applies the exact same logic to rivers. If there is a river separating you from the enemy, the amateur move is to spread your men out thin along the entire bank, trying to shoot every single boat as it crosses.
Right, defending every inch.
You can't do it. The enemy will eventually concentrate their boats at one spot and break through your thin line.
So what's the Clausewitzian move?
Back up. Withdraw from the immediate riverbank. Let a portion of the enemy army cross completely unmolested. Wait until they have a sizable force on your side of the river, but before they have had time to organize and before the rest of their army can cross to help them, they are disorganized, trying to form up, and they have their backs strapped against the water. Then you hit them with your concentrated forces.
You wait until they are in the most vulnerable position possible halfway through a doorway, and then you slam the door on them.
He cites the Battle of Aspern as the perfect historical illustration of how this should work. The Archduke Charles allowed Napoleon's forces to partially cross the Danube before launching a massive attack, pinning the French against the river and handing Napoleon his first major defeat in a decade.
And he also talks about Wagram again here, right?
Yes, conversely, Clausewitz criticizes the Austrians at Wagram for backing up too far from the river, allowing Napoleon to cross his entire army and organize them before attacking, thereby losing the advantage of the river entirely.
It all circles back to the concept of active defense. The terrain isn't a magical shield you hide behind, hoping the enemy goes away. It is an anvil. You use the mountain or the river to restrict the enemy's movement, and then you use your troops as the hammer to crush them against it.
It's all about creating the trap.
This naturally scales up into his theories on grand strategy. We've talked about the mindset of the commander, we've talked about how to spring a tactical trap, we've talked about how to use the ground. Now we need to zoom all the way out and look at the whole map.
Strategy, as Clausewitz defines it in this 1812 essay, is the combination of all these individual tactical engagements to attain the ultimate goal of the campaign, and he outlines three very clear overarching aims of war.
Read them out for us.
First, conquer and destroy the armed power of the enemy. You must eliminate their ability to fight. Second, take possession of his material resources, the cities, the armories, the storehouses. You must eliminate their ability to supply themselves. Third, gain public opinion.
I was struck by how he defines gaining public opinion. Today, we think of public opinion as social media campaigns or press releases. Clausewitz says you gain public opinion through great undeniable victories and the physical occupation of the enemy's capital city.
It's very literal.
It's a very tangible, brutal metric for public relations. You win the psychological war by making the physical reality of their defeat undeniable. But the way a commander achieves these strategic aims involves a concept that completely flipped my understanding of warfare. I'm talking about the concept of envelopment, surrounding the enemy.
Yes, this is a big one.
Now, on a local, tactical level like surrounding a single division in a valley, Clausewitz agrees that envelopment is great. But on a strategic level, across the map of a whole country, Clausewitz argues that being surrounded is often actually better than surrounding your enemy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that is a very difficult concept for people to accept. It makes perfect logistical and geometric sense, but it requires us to understand what we call interior lines.
Okay, let's unpack interior lines.
Imagine you have a massive army of 100,000 men. You decide you want to strategically surround the enemy. So you break your army into 4 separate pieces of 25,000 men each, and you march them in a giant ring around the enemy's borders.
Sounds like a brilliant checkmate.
Yeah.
You have them boxed in from the north, southeast, and west.
On a map, it looks beautiful. But in the physical reality of 1812, your 4 armies are now separated by dozens, maybe hundreds of miles of terrain. They cannot communicate quickly. They cannot physically support each other if one gets attacked. The enemy, meanwhile, is entirely concentrated in the center of your ring. They possess interior lines.
Let's use a physical analogy. Imagine a giant bicycle wheel. The surrounded enemy is sitting at the hub in the center. Your 4 armies are spread out along the rim of the tire.
Exactly. If the enemy in the center wants to attack one of your armies, they just march straight down one of the spokes of the wheel. It's a short, direct distance. They take their entire unified force of, say, 60,000 men, and they smash into just one of your isolated 25,000-man armies. You are crushed by overwhelming local superiority.
Because they hit you with their whole fist and you only have one finger there to block it.
Yes. Then the enemy pivots, walks back up the spoke, and goes down another spoke to smash your next army. They destroy your giant ring piece by piece, and because you are on the rim of the wheel, you have to march the long, curved way around the outside just to reach your allies, which takes far too long.
He points out that Frederick II tried strategic envelopment in 1757. He invaded Bohemia concentrically from multiple sides, and it resulted in the Battle of Kolin, which was a disaster that forced Frederick to give up all the territory he had just spent weeks capturing. Clausewitz is essentially saying, look, massive, concentrated battles decide everything. Do not separate your forces trying to be clever on a map.
He specifically notes that Emperor Napoleon, who was the master of this era, almost never used strategic envelopment. Napoleon kept his forces tightly concentrated. He didn't care if the enemy was on his flanks or his rear, as long as his main body was kept together.
He just barreled through.
Because of this, Napoleon was almost always physically and morally superior at the actual point of contact. He didn't spread his troops out in a giant, fragile ring.
There is also a massive logistical reality to grand strategy that prevents you from just wandering around the map trying to surround people. Provisioning. Feeding the men. Clausewitz points out quite bluntly that food dictates the theater of war.
You cannot ignore the food.
In 1812, Armies were too big to rely solely on huge, slow-moving supply wagons creeping along behind them from their home country. They had to use requisitions, meaning they had to live off the land they were marching through.
Which requires moving through wealthy, fertile provinces.
Hmm.
The biological need to feed 100,000 men and 20,000 horses literally dictates the path of the invasion. You cannot march an army through a barren wasteland or a burned-out province, no matter how clever the strategic flanking maneuver might look on paper, because your army will starve and disintegrate before they fire a single shot. The map is not a blank chessboard. It is a geography of calories.
Okay, so up to this point, Clausewitz has given the young prince this incredibly logical, interlocking machine of a theory. Makes so much sense. You accept the risk, you use active defense to set a trap, you mass your artillery to blast a hole, you use reverse slopes to hide, and you keep your army concentrated so you don't get defeated in detail. It sounds like a perfect system.
It does, doesn't it?
But then, in the final section of the essay, Clausewitz completely pulls the rug out from under the prince. He saves his most famous and, frankly, his most vital lesson for the very end.
He introduces the concept of friction.
Friction. Warfare is simple to plan on paper, but it is unbelievably difficult to actually execute. Clausewitz writes this incredible line: "The conduct of war resembles the workings of an intricate machine with tremendous friction, so that combinations which are easily planned on paper can be executed only with great effort."
It is the defining concept of his entire military philosophy. You can have the perfect plan, the perfect geometry, the perfect supply lines, but the moment you try to move that machine in the real world, 1,000 invisible forces start dragging against it.
What I love about this section is that he isn't just talking about physical friction. He's not just complaining about muddy roads or broken wagon wheels or rain. He deeply explores the psychological elements of friction, the way the human mind buckles under the stress of command.
The mental toll is immense.
He outlines several massive psychological hurdles a commander will face, and reading them, it feels like it could have been written yesterday about any modern leadership crisis. Let's talk about the psychological toll. There's a whole section on how the fog of war and your own mind betray you the moment the plan goes into action.
Clausewitz notes that the first massive source of friction is the sheer volume of false information. Humans are naturally timid and tend to exaggerate danger. The moment you march, your spies, your outposts, and panicked local villagers will flood your headquarters with reports that the enemy is twice as big as they actually are, or that they are attacking from a direction you didn't expect.
Which immediately triggers the second psychological trap: doubting your own carefully laid plans. You spent weeks looking at the map. You made the mathematical decisions in the calm of your tent. But the moment you are in the field and the rumors start swirling, a feeling of uneasiness takes hold. You start second-guessing yourself.
It's inevitable.
You think, maybe I should pause. Maybe I should wait for more information. And Clausewitz warns that this doubt leads to indecision, and indecision leads to fatal half measures.
And this doubt is compounded by the fact that you cannot see your own army. Your forces are dispersed across miles of terrain. You send an order to a division commander and you don't hear back for hours. You wonder, are they in position? Did the messenger get shot? Are they retreating? That uncertainty makes the commander want to halt everything until they know for sure. But in war, delay is death.
And then there's the echo chamber of command. I bet every manager or leader listening to this will relate to this point. Subordinates exaggerating difficulties. You tell your generals to march 20 miles. The reports come back. The road is too muddy, the men are too tired, the shoes are falling apart, the horses are sick.
They'll find every reason.
If a commander listens to every single complaint and tries to accommodate every hardship, Clausewitz says the entire army will be reduced to weakness and complete inactivity.
You have to balance that against the physical drag of the universe. Clausewitz warns about the friction of time and distance. You plan for a corps to reach a vital crossroads by noon. They arrive at dusk. The physical world constantly resists your schedule. You have to expect that your army will not function perfectly.
The armchair general mistake.
He explicitly warns the prince against it. If you expect your units to be at 100% strength, if you expect every musket to fire and every soldier to be healthy, you are living in a fantasy. Armies melt away from disease, straggling, and exhaustion before they even see the enemy. If you demand a perfectly functioning machine before you act, you will never act.
The friction of logistics. The constant gnawing friction of feeding the machine. Your brilliant strategic development has to be paused because the flour wagons are stuck in the mud 10 miles back. But I think the most profound, the most terrifying cause of friction Clausewitz details is the visual impact of combat.
The vivid, terrifying visual impressions of the battlefield overriding mature, logical reflection.
He writes that the visual impressions you get during the actual combat are infinitely more vivid and powerful than anything you planned beforehand by mature reflection in your tent. When you see the casualties being carried past you, when you hear the deafening roar of the cannons, when you see the sheer chaos of a cavalry charge breaking through your lines, your natural, biological instinct is fear, self-preservation, and exaggerated caution.
Your brain just screams at you to stop.
It's like writing a pristine, perfect workout plan on a Sunday evening. You sit at your desk with your coffee, you are calm, you are logical, and you map out this brutal 5-day-a-week, 5.0 a.m. routine. It's beautiful on paper. It makes perfect mathematical sense for your health goals.
I know this feeling too well.
Right. But then 5 a.m. on Monday hits. Your alarm goes off in the dark. It is freezing cold in your bedroom. You are exhausted. Your muscles ache. And in that immediate, vivid moment of physical reality, your brain invents 100 incredibly convincing, logical-sounding reasons why you shouldn't go to the gym. I need sleep to recover. I'll just go twice as hard tomorrow. I feel a cold coming on.
It's friction.
That is friction. Your present vivid reality is violently fighting against your past logic. Now take that 5 a.m. feeling and multiply it by 100,000 freezing, starving, terrified soldiers with screaming horses and solid iron cannonballs tearing through the air.
That is a phenomenal analogy that perfectly scales up to the reality of command. The present reality demands that you stop. So how does Clausewitz tell the young prince to overcome this immense, crushing friction? Because his answer is not comforting. He tells the prince that overcoming friction requires a severity bordering on cruelty.
A severity bordering on cruelty. That is a chilling piece of advice to give a teenager.
It is the harsh truth of military leadership. You have to demand the absolute maximum exertion from your troops, often driving them past their physical breaking points. He uses the historical example of the French Marshal Massena during the brutal siege of Genoa and the campaign in Portugal.
Tell us about Genoa.
Let's look at Genoa in 1800. Massena was trapped in the city, besieged by the Austrians, and blockaded by the British fleet. The conditions were apocalyptic. Starvation was rampant. The soldiers were eating horses, dogs, rats, and grass. Disease was tearing through the ranks. The friction was absolute.
But he didn't give up.
No. Massena subjected his troops and the civilian population to limitless exertion and suffering, driven entirely by his own harshness and unbreakable willpower. It is said his hair turned completely white during the siege.
And it worked.
It worked. By holding out in Genoa through sheer, cruel willpower, Massena tied down tens of thousands of Austrian troops, which allowed Napoleon the time he needed to cross the Alps and win the decisive Battle of Marengo. Massena held out in Portugal later in his career longer than anyone else deemed mathematically or physically possible. Overcoming friction requires a commander to have blind faith in their prior reflections over their current terrifying panic.
Blind faith in your past self. When the cannons are firing and the casualties are mounting, you have to tell yourself, the plan I made on Sunday when I was calm is smarter than the panic I'm feeling right now on Monday.
Precisely. And Clausewitz adds a fascinating psychological coda to this. He says you cannot overcome the crushing weight of friction with cold, calculating logic alone. Logic will tell you to retreat when the men are starving. You need a powerful emotional drive to keep the machine moving.
You need a fire.
You need the burning ambition of a Caesar. You need the deep-seated hatred of the enemy of a Hannibal. Or you need the unbreakable pride of a Frederick the Great. You need an emotional furnace inside you to burn through the friction of reality.
He ends the essay by telling the young prince to study military history, but not to memorize lists of rules or geometric formations. He says to study history to internalize this concept of friction. He points to his mentor, Scharnhorst, and his defense of Menin in 1794.
Scharnhorst was brilliant there.
Scharnhorst was surrounded, outnumbered, and in a seemingly hopeless situation. But he refused to surrender. He held on, executing a desperate breakout. It is the ultimate historical testament to the idea that you must never despair until the very last moment. Good principles and absolute willpower can subtly pull you through even when you've completely given up hope.
It is a remarkable, sobering piece of writing. It strips away all the romance, the medals, and the glorious paintings of war, and leaves only the psychological endurance test of command.
We have taken quite a journey today. We started with a 16-year-old prince receiving a personalized cheat sheet as his kingdom faced destruction in 1812. We navigated the historical projection of the 1942 audiences who mistook this tactical manual for a Nazi blueprint. We learned to radically rethink the concept of caution. We learn to embrace active defense as a judo trap rather than a shield. We examine the physics of massing artillery and hiding behind reverse slopes. And finally, we walk through the brutal psychological gauntlet of friction.
It is a text that proves exactly why Clausewitz remains so heavily studied in military academies worldwide. The technology of war completely changes. We do not use linear musket formations or cavalry charges anymore, but the psychological burden of command, the friction of physical reality resisting human plans, that remains an eternal human struggle.
Absolutely. And that brings me directly back to you, the listener. You are probably not commanding cavalry charges today. You are probably not trying to outflank the Austrian army on the banks of the Danube. But the principles we unpack today, adapting to friction, maintaining audacious goals when the math is against you, understanding that true caution is preparation, not timidity, those are incredibly relevant to whatever campaign you're fighting.
They apply everywhere.
And I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on that last profound point about friction. Clausewitz explicitly warns us that the vivid, terrifying visual impressions of the moment will always try to override our logical plans. He says we must have blind faith in the results of our own earlier reflections to survive the panic of the present.
It's hard to do.
Very hard. Because look at the world we live in today. We live in a modern, data-obsessed environment. We are constantly, endlessly bombarded with real-time metrics. We get panicked news alerts pushed to our wrist. We get instant feedback on our phones. We are completely drowning in the vivid visual impressions of the now.
And it causes fiction.
Exactly. So the question is, in a world that never stops screaming the current metrics at you, are we losing the ability to trust our own mature reflections? How much of your daily strategy, your career trajectory, your long-term goals, your life is being derailed and defeated by the friction of the present moment? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Next time you face the friction, remember the 16-year-old prince. Ignore the noise and trust the plan you made before the cannon started firing.